Britain's Conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening to you. It's 7:04 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's great to be back, and thanks to Ben Kentish for sitting in last week when I was in Washington. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed as I talked to people, politicians, journalists, all sorts of people in Washington, was the fact that they all knew the name Dame Karen Pierce, who is our ambassador in Washington. They all had a high opinion of her. There was not a single person I met who uttered any criticism whatsoever. They thought that she really puts forward the case for Britain in Washington, like very few ambassadors have done over the years. And so I wanted to interview her when I was there because I think she is a fascinating character. She'd been ambassador in Afghanistan. I first came to know her, observe her. I think I interviewed her a couple of times when she was our ambassador at the United Nations. And we talk about that a little bit in the interview that you're just about to hear. So I was absolutely fascinated to meet her. And we recorded the interview last Monday, just before Rishi Sunak stood up in the House of Commons to announce that the Northern Ireland Protocol Agreement, the Windsor Framework, had been agreed. So we obviously talked about that and how important that was with regard to US-UK relations. And I really wanted to know, what does an ambassador actually do all day? Because we have this image of ambassadors holding receptions and all the Ferrero Rocher. I have to say that the reception that was held at the Deputy Ambassador's residence to launch my President's book, there was no Ferrero Rocher in sight, which I was, as a diabetic, obviously I was very, very grateful for. Now, listen, we are streaming this interview in video on Global Player if you'd like to watch it as well. So do switch that on. We talked about lots of things in this interview, and I think you're going to find it absolutely fascinating. So here she is, Dame Karen Pierce.
It's a large part of my job, Northern Ireland. It's a very important issue for both our countries, as you know. The Americans feel some ownership of the Good Friday Agreement. They leaned in. President Clinton leaned in. I was actually here in Washington at the time, and it was very difficult when they first leaned in with Gerry Adams's visa. But since then, we got the Good Friday Agreement, we got the talks. There's always been an American special envoy. And the President Biden, is very interested in affairs Irish, given his background. So it's a large part of what I do, and I've spent the morning on the phone to people in the administration and Congress explaining the deal the Prime Minister has got, and we've had wide-ranging support.
And American politicians they all sort of claim some sort of Irish heritage, don't they? It's a really big deal for them, which I sometimes wonder whether we in Britain really recognise that and can understand it.
I think it's difficult, to be honest, for Brits to understand, because there's nothing that's easily comparable for us. And there are societies all over America. The Ancient Order of Hibernians has branches here. There are Irish-American bars. It's a really big part of what you might think of as ordinary culture. So
what do you think this is going to open up? Because I mean, we were reading newspaper reports that President Biden wouldn't come over for the 25th anniversary celebrations of the Good Friday Agreement if this deal wasn't done. Presumably, he will now.
No, I don't think that's automatic. I think the White House is still working out the president's schedule for the rest of the year. There are a number of events that might bring him to Europe for different purposes. I think where we've got to is that the Prime Minister has got this deal with the EU, the Windsor Framework. What now needs to happen is for the DUP and the other communities in Northern Ireland to study it, to give a considered reaction, and then hopefully we'll see if we can get the executive back up and running. But I think the Prime Minister's been clear he wants to give some space for that.
Do you think this, in that notorious phrase, gets Brexit done? Because it seems to be that it's almost the final piece in the jigsaw. Do you think there are further negotiations to be done?
No, I think as far as the EU goes, the Prime Minister was clear. He wants to make sure that Brexit works for every part of the United Kingdom, and that has to include Northern Ireland. So in that sense, that's what he's achieved.
Now, you've been in this role for 3 years now. What does a day look like, a typical day, if there is such a thing, in an ambassador's life?
Well, fortunately, each day isn't typical, which is one of the reasons why I really like the job. But if I give you a flavour of today, it was spent in contacts with the administration, with Congress, with Number 10 and with London, all on this agreement reached with Ursula von der Leyen and what we're going to say about it, what the public statements will be, what more information we can give those parts of the American government that are interested. It involves press work coming down to see you. I also was talking to the board of the Marshall Scholarships. The Marshalls is a programme established by Britain after the Second World War to thank the American people for the Marshall Plan. So we spent some time on that. It's an important programme for us. And then after this, I have a dinner tonight for the new president of Johns Hopkins University.
And I mean, in terms of the kind of things that you do, and that's what you're doing today, but is the primary role presumably to represent Britain in the United States, whatever is going on in Britain, whatever the British government's policy is towards X, Y or Z, that is your job to persuade American politicians that it's the right thing to do?
I like it's the right thing to do, but it's not just to represent. That sounds a bit passive. It's fundamentally to align policies wherever we can, because the world is safer and more prosperous and more secure when Britain and America work together, and history has proved that countless times. But it's also to present a really positive image of Britain to the American people and to America. And it's to take forward ways of cooperation right the way across the political, the economic, the security agenda. It doesn't always mean we'll agree. There's actually quite a few times when we don't agree. But the important thing about that is that no one issue tends to dominate the relationship.
And you mentioned the word relationship there, this whole phrase special relationship. I always think that politicians on both sides of the Atlantic feel they have to keep talking about the special relationship, but they all cringe when they say it, because from a British point of view, I always think it sounds a little bit craven and that sort of a bit needy, but it's every American president, if they don't say it when they come to Britain, then there's trouble, isn't there?
Well, there's trouble because your colleagues always ask, is it still special, Prime Minister? Is it still special, Mr. President? So I think it's a shorthand phrase for what is a deep, profound and successful relationship across many fronts, almost, if you like, every nook and cranny of political, social life. We do something of it with the Americans.
Because actually, if you look at it in historical terms, it's quite a recent phenomenon, isn't it? It really only started in the Second World War. Whereas if you go back through British-American relations going back to sort of 1789, I mean, it's a pretty tricky times, and it wasn't a special relationship at all until the 20th century.
Well, Washington signed a treaty with the Brits in 1795, and then in 1812, as any American schoolchild will tell you, we sail in and we burn the White House and do some other things. But then it all settles down. We cooperate with the Americans. I think one thing we were greatly helped by is what the Queen used to call common kinship. There are a lot of families, Churchill's was one of them, but not the only one, that were intertwined. And that certainly helped each country understand each other in those decades of the late 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. But I think I'd agree with you. We were getting closer and closer since the start of the 1900s. The First World War kind of gives that a boost. Yeah. Then there was lots of economic work. And then as you come into the run-up to the Second World War, the cooperation really starts to thicken up. And of course, Churchill and FDR were a huge boost to that.
You've been in the diplomatic service or foreign office since, was it 1981, if I got that right?
It's a long time ago.
How has diplomacy changed in that time, the way that we in Britain do diplomacy? Because I suspect back in 1981, the Foreign Office was a much more sort of fustier place than it is now.
It was fustier, but it was also, if I may say so, a bit more tolerant of mavericks. It could encompass quite a lot in its fustiness.
Is that a self-description there?
I've been a maverick. I've decided to give that up, and
Have
I'm
you?
now
Right, okay.
a reformed maverick and part of the establishment. At least I hope I'm part of the establishment. I remember when I was here as a junior diplomat in Washington, somebody wrote in to ask the ambassador to do a talk on were diplomats like sailing ships, in other words, a relic of a previous century. And he was able to quote Kissinger back at them, which is always a good thing to do. But I think fundamentally the techniques of diplomacy and the reason diplomacy exists as a tradecraft, whether you think it's an art or a science, don't actually change through the centuries. Churchill said it's about gaining an advantage. It's certainly about making things work, hopefully to the betterment of your country.
Now, the job of British ambassador in America presumably is still seen as the sort of pinnacle of everyone's ambition. Every ambassador in every country wants to be ambassador in Washington. Having served here before in the 1990s, I mean, did you ever think at that point, I could be ambassador one day? Was that your ambition?
I never thought I could be ambassador. I used to think, oh my God, I'd like to be ambassador. But then I was a very junior diplomat and the ambassador was a very senior person. So it's not a direct line. You can't kind of see a way when you're in your early 30s. But gradually, as I stayed in the Foreign Office and went to a number of postings, I did start to feel that almost everything I was doing would be useful in Washington. And I'm glad to say I was lucky enough to come here.
And you're listening to an interview with the British ambassador to the United States, Dame Karen Pierce. We'll hear more from Dame Karen in just a few moments' time. I'm Iain Dale. You're listening to LBC. It's 7:15.
LBC.
It's past 7. Let me just tell you who's going to be on Cross Question at 8 o'clock. George Freeman, the Conservative MP for Mid-Norfolk and the Science, Research and Innovation Minister. Baroness Jenny Jones, Green Party peer and former Deputy Mayor of London. Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank. And Marina Purkis, political commentator and co-host of the podcast The Trawl, which you can find on Global Player. Now, we have a completely empty switchboard at the moment, so if you want to ask the panel a question, you can do so. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Well, let's continue with our conversation with Dame Karen Pierce, the British ambassador to the United States. Now, she was also in New York as Britain's permanent representative to the United Nations, effectively our ambassador to the UN. It's a role which involves exchanges with every other government in the world, and I personally found her to be very impressive at it. So I asked her if, during what can be some pretty hostile exchanges with some pretty hostile nations, representatives, does being a woman actually help her be better at the job?
I never have thought of it like that. It might well be, especially for the other people taking part in the meeting. But I personally never approached it like that. But I do think there's something very important about running a meeting well. And I had some good tutors in the Foreign Office, one of whom was my former ambassador here, Robin Rennick, but there have been many others. And I think if you can run a meeting well, as you saw, it gets you a long way. Yeah. And then people come to respect your convening power and the fact that you can get something out of a meeting which becomes important.
Is that a more difficult job than this one in some ways? Because you've got so many different interests to compete with, or so many different people, so many different kinds of countries to get to a common position. Whereas here, it's us and them, and you try and persuade them, whereas in the UN, it's all sorts of different countries.
I think the interagency system in America makes it more like the UN style than one might imagine. Sometimes it's not just about moving one part of the administration, it's about bringing the whole interagency process together. And it has been well said of the Brits in the past that one thing we do know how to do is how to work all bits or how to deal with all bits of the US interagency, because we have this close working at all levels and in all areas. But they're just very different styles of working. There's much more nuance in a bilateral relationship, including here. There are many different equities, different types of equity to move. So a congressional equity will be different from an administration equity, will be different from civil society, different from a CEO's. At the UN, fundamentally, although the countries are different, what they're trying to do, Churchill's gain and advantage, is actually very similar.
And I remember during the Falklands War, Sir Anthony Parsons was in the job that you later held. And he was absolutely crucial to putting the British case forward there, wasn't he? I don't think you had anything quite like the Falklands War to deal with, but what was the most difficult part of that job in your time there?
I think the nearest equivalent to the Falklands would be the Salisbury poisonings. So I got to the UN as ambassador just after those had taken place, when the Russians were trying to ramp up a campaign in the Security Council. And that was quite gladiatorial. In a way, to go into there day after day and take on the Russian case and try and demolish it and try and get the rest of the council on side, and then to hold briefings outside the Security Council for other members so they could see our evidence, see what we'd uncovered, to work with OPCW in The Hague, the Chemical Weapons Organisation, for the analysis of those samples. And it was a real whole of team effort by the UK mission in New York. I was incredibly proud of the way everybody came together, right down to the jokes. You know, something that got quoted in the press was after the Russian ambassador had read out something like 23 reasons why it wasn't them and it was something else. We had this great line about Alice in Wonderland, Alice having said, "Sometimes I can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast." The Russian ambassador was much given to quoting Alice, so we were able to use that.
And, I mean, when you have to look the Russian ambassador in the eye and tell him directly, you were very direct, weren't you? I mean, there was no sort of diplomatic pussyfooting there. You were straight at him. Is that a difficult thing to do? Because presumably you all have personal relationships outside the formal meetings.
It is difficult, but and this is back to a time pre-invasion of Ukraine. I don't think it would be remotely the same now, but at that time, interestingly, the Secretary-General used to think the P5, the permanent members' relationships, were personally too good. He worried that would inhibit us from actually challenging each other and trying to get the UN system to a better place, which I thought was an interesting angle. But I think when you're in that situation, you're just conscious that you have a job to do and you have to uphold your country, and fundamentally you have to fight, though verbally, for your country and your people. And what had happened on the streets of Salisbury to the citizens of Salisbury was absolutely dreadful. And it was right to call that out and right to take the Russians on. I think I was greatly helped, though, by the fact that for most of my junior career, I worked with the Russians as often as I worked with the Americans, because I worked on arms control.
So you understood them?
I would like to think I understand a bit. No one understands Russia properly, you know, a mystery wrapped in a puzzle, wrapped in an enigma. But I think it was a help.
And in terms of the UN, what are there automatically countries that you gravitate towards to work with closely? Do they tend to be sort of NATO countries, or is the position now where, because the global south is becoming far more important, you have to really nurture new relationships with countries that maybe we wouldn't have been close to before for maybe historical reasons?
I think that's exactly right. I think one of the real dangers of the UN, and the Foreign Secretary James cleverly pointed to this in his recent speech, it's too easy to talk to people who agree with you.
Yeah.
You can do lots of initiatives, nice initiatives, with people who share not just your values but your outlook and your assessment. And those are always great to do because everybody's on the same page. The much more difficult task, and this is what he's challenged the Foreign Office and British diplomats to go out and do, is to find people who fundamentally don't think like you do, and then find a way of working with them and find a way of advancing a common goal.
And is this the case in the whole Ukraine situation, where there are many countries that I would have thought actually ought to be condemning Russia, but they're either abstaining in the UN or, well, not many are actually voting with Russia. But I mean, India, for example, which I always think we should have a really close relationship with, but their stance on the Ukraine war, I mean, I find almost incomprehensible. Is that where a lot of diplomatic input would be deployed to try and get countries like India on side?
We spend a lot of time collectively explaining our position to other countries, and India is obviously a very important country, so we spend a lot of time talking to India about this. I think there are several factors going on at once there, and you'd really have to ask the Indian government, but I think Russia has had historically very good relations with some of these countries, and they find it hard to move away. And I think linked to that, there is a feeling at the UN that countries don't want to take sides. Now, we find that pretty incomprehensible because we think we're open societies, Russia, China are autocratic societies. It's in your interest to want to be on the side of open societies because that will bring more benefits to ordinary citizens. That sounds like a perfectly logical argument to us. It's not necessarily a perfectly logical argument to countries with a different history. So we have to keep trying to make that case and keep trying to demonstrate that we understand their concerns and can wrap those concerns up into what we're trying to do, which fundamentally is defend the UN Charter and help Ukraine defend itself.
What about the relationship with the American government on Ukraine? Because, I mean, it seems as though NATO has been far more united than Putin ever thought it would be. The EU, I think, also has been far more united as well. How does the relationship between you and the American government work on things like Ukraine?
Well, we work incredibly closely, as you'd expect. The diplomats, the defence people in the embassy, the defence equipment people in the embassy, the export control people, the people doing the political and intelligence analysis. It's kind of a 24/7 thing, and that's exactly what I would expect in a crisis like this. We also work very closely at 3 with the Ukrainian embassy and ambassador here, and just to give her she has been absolutely outstanding representative of her country.
They all are, aren't they? This is the thing. The Ukrainians have been brilliant at PR,
They have.
sending their very media-friendly MPs out, particularly to Britain. I mean, I've had them all on my programme, and they are all amazing in the way that they explain it.
And exactly that, and really inspiring to see what they're doing for their country.
And they're mainly female. I mean, I don't know whether this is a deliberate thing by them, but all the ones that we get are sort of 30, 32-year-old female MPs. And of course, if you're somebody who's thinking, yeah, I think I might quite like to take in a Ukrainian refugee, you kind of want maybe a sort of family person rather than a sort of gnarled 65-year-old white male politician.
No, I'm sure people are generous in taking everybody in, as generous as they can be. But I would just like to say something about what you say about transatlantic unity. It's not just within NATO and within the EU, it's actually NATO and the EU. When you think of what Putin has done, if I ran a profit and loss account in the Kremlin, he's brought NATO much closer to Russia's own
Two
borders.
new members.
He's united the Ukrainian people where he thought to divide them. He's got more transatlantic unity than he ever had nightmares was possible. And he set out to re-establish the Russian Empire, and he's recreated the Soviet economy of 30 years ago. If I sat in the Kremlin, I wouldn't think that was a good investment.
And I'm talking to Dame Karen Pierce, the UK ambassador to Washington. More from her in just a few moments. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 7:30. Let's get the latest LBC News headlines from Amelia Cox.
A senior officer with the Metropolitan Police has said sorry Wayne Couzens wasn't arrested before he killed Sarah Everard. The 50-year-old has been handed a 19-month sentence for indecent exposure in the months prior to her murder. Gwent and South Wales Police have referred themselves to the IOPC following the deaths of 3 people in Cardiff. 2 people were also found injured in a crash almost 48 hours after the group were reported missing following a night out. And refugee groups say new government plans to ban people who try to get to Britain on small boats for life are immoral and unworkable. The full plan will be set out by ministers tomorrow. LBC weather: spells of rain turning to sleet and snow in places in the south tonight. Cold and clearer further north, a low of -5 degrees.
This is LBC.
Spree, Christy says, marvellous interview with the ambassador. Now, when I go to the US and stay at the ambassador's place, do they put those little chocolates on your pillow? I wouldn't know because I didn't stay there. I stayed in a hotel. I'd quite like to have done that. It's a marvellous place. Now, cross question at 80345 6060973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. Conservative Minister George Freeman, Baroness Jenny Jones from the Green Party, Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank, and Marina Perkis, co-presenter of the Troll podcast, are going to be with me. But first, Andy Sylvester is editor of City AM and joins me now. Andy, very good evening. Now, Tony Danker, who's a regular guest on LBC, he's director of the CBI, but he's had to stand down. Why?
Yeah, evening, Iain. One story in town, although it certainly isn't the end of it. Yeah, Britain's most senior business lobbyist has stepped down, at least temporarily, as a result of allegations of workplace misconduct. Now, Tony Danker, the CBI DG, has asked to step aside whilst an independent investigation into his behaviour is underway. I won't get into the details of the claims because, frankly, I can't corroborate them. But clearly another newspaper has gone to the CBI and that's triggered an investigation. For his part, Danker today saying that he was mortified and that he's caused offence or anxiety to any colleagues, said it's the right decision to take an independent investigation and he'll support and go along with that investigation. It's bad news for the CBI because Danker has, since taking over in 2020, managed to turn the reputation of that particular business group around and rebuild relations with the government, which were, to be honest, pretty grim post the sort of rigmarole around Brexit. So we'll wait and see. Can't prejudge it. Of course, CBI right to say that any allegations remain currently unproven. But yeah, Danker stepping aside for a period of time whilst these investigations are ongoing.
Andy, thank you. That's Andy Sylvester, editor of City AM. Now let's return to the ambassador's role in Anglo-American relations. And I asked about what happens when ministers in London want to suggest a new international plan to their counterparts in Washington. Is Dame Karen Pierce asked to act as an intermediary?
Sometimes it depends a little bit on what sort of issue it was. Was there a meeting that they were all in together? Is the idea a follow-up to that meeting or a precursor to that meeting? Or is it something that needs to be shaped and refined and crafted? The former, more likely London would do it direct. The latter, more likely the embassy would do it. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, depending on the issue, who you have to talk to. Usually we would do it together, one after the other. So we reinforce and then we can collect American views and refine.
And how does it work when there's a clear difference of opinion between the two governments? How do you sort of try to? I mean, you I think here for the last 10 months of the Trump administration, weren't you? Which must, I mean, well, let's ask that. How different was dealing with that administration to this one? This is where the diplomat comes in, isn't it?
You'd expect it to be very different, reflecting the different styles and philosophies, and of course it was. And it's an ambassador's job and an embassy's job to adapt to those different styles so that you can preserve your country's reputation and advance your country's interests and advance friendship with the American people, which is enduring and doesn't change. I would say that one critical difference was that the Trump administration was more ad hoc. It didn't work through systems. The Biden administration, in my view, is more traditional. It works through systems. So the embassy style has to adapt to take all of that into account.
And how much access do you have to the president? Because I've read all the different memoirs of ambassadors through the years. I mean, Christopher Mayer's one where he was deputed to get as far up George Bush's arse as he possibly could by I don't know whether
Jonathan Powell.
Was it Jonathan Powell?
Jonathan Powell told him that. He was his chief of staff. And in the embassy,
and quite right.
When I was first in the embassy.
Because, I mean, I think he first came when the primaries were going on and sort of nobody quite knew who was going to win. And building those relationships is fantastically important for the long term, isn't it?
Oh, I completely agree. It's central in a way to what an ambassador does. And at the UN, as you were asking earlier, a lot of it is about the issues. what do you want to achieve on this issue and what's the path to it. In the United States, in Washington, a lot of it is about the relationships, knowing who has influence and who's important, knowing how they can affect what might happen, what Britain might want, what might happen in NATO, what might happen globally. That becomes incredibly important.
And in one of his books, Robin Rennick said that he would go and visit the candidate. I think he visited George W. Bush in his home before he was even really a serious candidate. So is that what you're doing now, sort of talent spotting and thinking, right, we need to do that with that one, that with the next one?
We do a lot of talent.
Yeah.
We do a lot of talent spotting and a lot of just getting to know prominent and influential Americans and spotting that someone might not be influential today but might be someone who will be so in the future, and trying to build a relationship. That's all part of the job. I would just say, though, it's slightly different than in Christopher's day, because you have this legislation now that limits the extent to which campaigning groups, presidents, can meet foreign representatives.
Oh, right.
So that is a
so
little
it makes
bit
it more
different.
Difficult for you.
Yeah.
How do you get over that?
We'll see.
Well, because it's kind of starting now, isn't it? The next campaign.
I don't think we've seen anything yet, as it were.
No, but there seems to be a whole raft of Republican candidates, but of course no one knows what will happen on the Democratic side until Joe Biden makes a formal decision, I guess.
My job, the embassy's job, is America.
Yeah.
Whoever the American people choose, it's our job to enhance the relationship and hopefully make them think well of Britain, and hopefully make them interested in the British people and explain to the British people why they should be interested in America.
How do you think Americans see Britain nowadays?
Most people I meet, most governors I talk to, so right the way across America, city halls, I went to the mayor's conference, I went to the governor's national conference, there is widespread affection and admiration for Britain, and widespread recognition that Britain is, in the words of a West Point cadet to me, ally number one. And that's very, very strong. They accept that we have a couple of economic issues at the moment, not least because some of the press is hammering that home. But nobody thinks it will last. I've not met anyone who says, I'm not going to invest in Britain because you have these economic problems at the moment. On the contrary, I meet people who say we want to invest in Britain because it shares our philosophy, American philosophy. It's built on the rule of law, common law, which I think is more important in the relationship than people realise. It's fundamentally all about freedom, and common law is about being able to do things unless they're prohibited. And if you have a coded legal system, it's a little bit more rigid. And I think that's a philosophical difference that has been there for a long time. But I would just like to say that people do believe Britain is a country of free enterprise, which we are, and they believe that we will unlock human potential to realise that free enterprise, and that forms a very strong bond. Something like 1.7 million Americans every day go to work for British companies who've invested in America, and 1.2 million Brits do the same in Britain with American companies. So the economic relationship is strong, but it's not always at the forefront of everybody's mind.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there is this perception in Britain that, it's sort of Americans and other countries coming to buy up British companies, and they never think, it works the other way around too,
right,
particularly in America.
Yeah, no, and some of what I do when I visit other states is go and see those companies, and we are pursuing with governors memoranda of understanding, so agreements between us about getting over regulatory obstacles like recognition of qualifications, so that we can get more trade and investment going in both directions.
How much time do you spend out of Washington? Because I guess everyone thinks you're spending all your time going to diplomatic parties, but it's not like that, is it? You're going around the country. Going around the country.
Would have done more had it not been for COVID, so I'm trying to make up time, get around all our consulates right the way across the US. We also have government offices, so we have something like 12 outposts, as it were, from Washington, going to meet the governors, which is why I spend a lot of time going to national conventions, because it's possible to get to know a lot of people very quickly all at once. And that's been fantastic. And everywhere, as I say, there is this enormous interest in the UK. America is a very generous country. It's always interested. It's always ready to talk.
It's 7:43.
LBC.
And I keep your calls coming for Cross Question at 8 o'clock. Now, we begin this final part of my interview with Dame Karen Pierce talking about one of the more memorable parts of her job as ambassador in Washington so far, representing the UK during the blanket coverage given by American media to the death of Her Majesty the Queen in September.
It was a very moving occasion. The American media did indeed give it very blanket and generous coverage. I think we were all surprised in the embassy by how much it dominated the news, and then when the outlets got to the UK and they would set up almost wall-to-wall broadcasting of what was happening with the whole week of commemoration leading up to that magnificent state funeral. And I would be invited on to TV shows and I'd be kept waiting for half an hour, 40 minutes, because the correspondents wanted to explain how moved they were by being in London at that time, which I thought was amazing and truly not something that had been seen for 70 years, so outside many people's consciousness in a way. But when the Queen died, the very first day, within a few hours, in fact, of the announcement, we had a call from the White House to say that the President and First Lady would like to come and sign the condolence books, and were we ready? And of course we weren't ready, but we said we were ready. And then everybody in the embassy, another fantastic example of everybody coming together. We managed to find a red carpet. We managed to polish the glass of the staircase. We had the condolence books ready because there'd been a little bit of advance notice from London. We had the flowers. We managed to create a space, a very dignified space, where the President and First Lady could come in and sign the condolence book in front of the crest. A number of people from the embassy wanted to see them, quite naturally. The military were there in their uniforms to salute and welcome the President. The First Lady very kindly brought some flowers. And the President did an impromptu speech to the group of embassy standing there. And he was fantastic. He got just the right balance between anecdotes about the Queen, having tea with her at Windsor Castle.
He must have met her quite often.
I think he'd met her a few times, but of course he'd been recently for Glasgow, the COP26, and before that for the G7. On both occasions he'd met the Queen, and I think on the first occasion had actually had a private audience with her at Windsor Castle. So he'd met her 3 times very recently. But he also said, quite rightly, she defined an era. And he was extraordinarily generous about the relationship, but also about the Queen and about King Charles. And then the Vice President came, the Secretary of State came, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Defence Secretary. Really, most of the American cabinet came, and very early on. And we were very moved by that, but we were moved also by the fact that ordinary American citizens just came to the embassy and queued for hours to sign the book. And some little girls would bring flowers and little messages, and they were all laid outside the embassy. We have a big flag, Union Jack, on the ground, and they would lay the flowers on that and queue. And that was amazing. We were very moved by that.
And I mean, it's a bit incongruous. The Americans sort of love, or I was going to say love of our royal family, is that the right word? But they are fascinated by it, aren't they? In the same way that I think the Germans are, and they sort of almost substitute our royal family, and they co-opt them as theirs in some way. Do you think that that relationship is going to change now with the change of monarch?
Let's see. It might be a bit different simply because, as we were saying earlier, most people have grown up knowing only the Queen as the sovereign of the United Kingdom. But I think the King has made an amazing start. People are very interested in his modernisation plans, very interested in what he wants to do with the monarchy. Interested also, I find here, in the fact that he went to all 4 parts of the United Kingdom almost immediately. And obviously very interested in the pageantry. I think it's the pageantry and the history as well. Some of the ceremonies at the Queen's funeral, as you know, went back to the 12th century and maybe even before that. When we see the coronation, I think some of the ceremony goes back to the 11th century, which is quite something when you think about it.
And a lot of people, I think, in this country, as well as our own, are starting to become quite obsessed with the record of the British Empire as to and what its pros and cons were. Does that make your job any more difficult? Because I mean, it's sort of allied to the Black Lives Matter movement and the argument for reparations. Is that something that you have to deal with as well when you're doing media interviews?
I get asked about it. I think the King has been very clear. There are conversations that need to be had about the slave trade, about what happened historically. We're not afraid to have those conversations. He himself is extraordinarily open to trying to bring communities in and hear their perspectives, historical or current. So I think that will continue. The government also, we were very interested in the Black Lives Matter movement and very conscious that we ourselves had troubling things in our own history. At the same time, I think everybody was shocked by what happened to George Floyd, and a great outpouring of wanting somehow to reassert the good values, the things that make people horrified by what they saw with George Floyd.
And I guess the monarchy can be a bridge. I mean, the Queen obviously had really good relations with the Obamas, with the Reagans. I mean, King Charles, I was having lunch with someone today who told me that he had an ongoing private correspondence with Nancy Reagan for decades almost, which I think a lot of it's kept in secret files in the Reagan Library, but some of it you can go and read, and they clearly were very, very close friends. And it's this whole thing about interpersonal relationships, isn't it, that in diplomacy, in government, in meetings of world leaders is so crucial.
Well, both the Queen and the King, when he was Prince of Wales, really loved coming to America, and the Queen came privately as well. King's been privately, but also officially. They've travelled across America. When I think I'm right in saying when the Queen was a little girl and she was taught English constitutional history, the master at Eton College who taught her English history was actually an American history specialist, and he taught her American history as well. And I had the honour to phone her shortly after I'd become ambassador and the election was happening, and she'd been reading the embassy's cables, and she had all these questions for me about what was really happening in American politics. But it was clear that she was coming at this from a perspective of great knowledge and understanding. And she had a fantastic set of phrases that she would use about common values as well as common heritage, and the fact that we had both chosen the democratic path. And that comes through a lot of the speeches she made with American leaders.
And how many staff work at the embassy in Washington?
Oh, all in all, including defence staff and support staff, it's about 750.
That's a huge number, isn't it?
It is a huge number. It used to be more.
Just tell us a little bit about what some of them do, because we see you doing all of the sort of diplomacy bit, but an embassy is there, or a consulate is there, to help people in distress as well. If they get into difficulties for whatever reason in this country, I guess you're the first people that they turn to. Give us a couple of examples of the kind of work you do on that sort of pastoral level.
Sure. So the embassy is divided into different sections, and it's large because it reflects the totality of the relationship, and that includes looking after the interests of British citizens and helping them. We have section in the embassy called a consular section, and they are the ones who are the front line, if you like, to help British citizens. And each of our consulates around America, they have a consular section as well doing the same thing. So, for example, during COVID, there was a big question about cruise ships, passengers who were in the Caribbean on cruise ships. We would liaise with the Miami authorities to get them into Miami, because not every port would let the cruise ships dock, including in the Caribbean. I have to say the Miami authorities were very helpful over this. We would then work out how we could best help the people, those who needed hospital treatment, those who needed help to get on a flight back to the UK. At some point in the crisis, we actually had to help run those flights because there weren't commercial flights at the time, but we had a lot of British subjects who needed to get back to the UK. So that's a crisis case, if you like, but that shows you the sorts of things we do. We help people who've lost their passports. Members of the consular staff will visit people who are in jail, British citizens who are in jail. They will give people advice on certain court cases. Sometimes we have family reunion cases, and the consular staff will help with all of those. It's a special skill, I think, to be able to deal with families who are in distress and be able to deal with them sympathetically while conveying what we can and can't do.
And how serious does something have to be to get to your desk?
Oh, I mean, if it's got to me, it's serious, I think is a better way of putting it.
And can you give us one example of something where you thought, well, without us, this person would have been in really dire straits, and we've really gone to the nth limit to help them?
Well, we don't like talking about individual cases, but there were cases of families who were stranded on either end of the Atlantic with a lot of visa problems during COVID, including some of your journalistic colleagues. And we were able to sort that out. We were able to get school kids back to school. We were able, I think one case in particular does spring to mind. When there was a blanket ban on people from the UK and Europe coming to the US, we suddenly had a humanitarian emergency where a child had died and a relative needed to come out from the UK to help the child's family, and we were able to resolve that. So yes, that's very special and important.
Final question: What part of your job is the one that you most enjoy? And is there a part of your job that you think, oh God, do I really have to do that?
I like all aspects of my job. I like the bit I'm doing most at the point at which I'm doing it. But I would pick a couple of things. My husband and I went to the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, in Pearl Harbor. And that was incredibly moving. And we went out on the launch to the Arizona, where it's tradition that you scatter petals in the name of the servicemen and women who died. And that was one of the most moving things I've done. I always try, because of my own background in security policy, to highlight the defence and security side, and that was incredible. At the other end of the scale, I had the great honour to go to the Elton John concert at the White House, which was amazing. And I got a shout out from the President, which I was over the moon about. So those are two very different types of thing, but poor me.
Well, I think that's a very uplifting way to end the interview. Ambassador, thank you very much for
nice
joining us.
Nice to talk to you.
And that was Dame Karen Pierce, our ambassador in the United States. Nick says, Iain, that was a fascinating interview, but let's face it, we all just want a good moan about Matt Hancock, Sue Gray, etc. You'll get your chance at 9 o'clock on that one, or possibly over the next hour with our cross-question panel. George Freeman, Conservative MP for Mid-Norfolk and the Science, Research and Innovation Minister, will be with us. Baroness Jenny Jones, Green Party peer, former Deputy Mayor of London. Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank, and Marina Purkis, political commentator and co-host of the podcast The Trawl, which you can of course find on Global Player. The number to call 0345 6060 973, only one space free on the switchboard at the moment. You can text 84850, or you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Metropolitan Police says Wayne Couzens brought shame on the profession as the force apologised for not arresting him before he murdered Sarah Everard. The former officer, who is serving a whole-life term, was today sentenced to 3 counts of indecent exposure. South Wales Police say they're trying to piece together what happened after 3 people were found dead in a car crash almost 48 hours after they went missing in Cardiff. They're 21-year-olds Eve Smith and Darcy Ross, and Raphael Jean, who's 24, while 2 others are in hospital. Britain's ambassador to the US has told Iain Dale on LBC there is wide-ranging support for the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. In an exclusive interview, Dame Karen Pierce